Hello. Okay, so the purpose of this video is to kind of describe how set notation works. And actually, well, the bulk of this is more on interval notation. But I just want to just clarify what some of you may have not understood about that set notation. Okay, so in class, what I mentioned earlier, what I helped you guys out with was I color coded it for you guys so you can kind of see how this works. So the orange brackets here mean the set, the green X means of all X's, the purple vertical line means such that, and then your equation or inequality, whatever you have here, is here. So this means X is not equal to 14. Okay, so in context, like where you would use this kind of set notation would be like, for example, like a rational function. So this is an example that I have in Desmos. So if you have something of this form, like 7 divided by x minus 14, well, as you can see in here, if x equals 14, well, if we know is, well, 14 minus 14 is 0, right? And recall that if we have 7 divided by 0, that's going to lead to something that's undefined. Or in other words, what this means is x can't equal 14, okay? So let's go ahead and just graph that line so you can kind of, if you don't believe me, I'm just going to go ahead and change some of the settings here. I'll make it a little like a dashed line so you kind of see. So what I mentioned in class was like, think of this as like the National Guard trying to protect all the protect Capitol Hill, yeah, from all the protesters and whatnot, right? So that's one way you can think about that. So as you can see here, this domain here is going to consist of all the numbers. The x's are not restricted here, except for that value x equals 14. So that's what that means in context. If I go back to this, so set notation here, this is just a fancy way of saying all real numbers except 14. Okay. Interval notation. Okay. So generally for interval notation, you want to use a square bracket to indicate an interval that includes an endpoint. So something like a closed dot. Use a parentheses to indicate an interval that doesn't include an endpoint, so like an open dot. Always use parentheses with positive infinity or negative infinity. Okay, x is greater than or equal to 1 is the same thing as having a square bracket at 1 and going off to infinity because the x values are becoming more positive. And this other case here, so x is less than 5 is the same thing as having a parentheses at 5, and it goes off to negative infinity because, as you can see, the x's become more negative. What I put here was just some examples of how you can convert an inequality here to interval notation. So for example, like I showed you guys previously in class, right? See these square brackets here? Square brackets are used if you have like an equal sign underneath. You use parentheses if you have parentheses. You do not need to include the equals underneath. If you have a square bracket and you have a parentheses, this would be the square bracket here, and the parentheses here means you don't include that, and so forth. For this one as well, you're not going to include it, so you don't have equal sign underneath there. But then the square bracket here means that you're gonna have the equal sign underneath. Okay. So let's say for these particular examples, here's some here that express a solution set. This particular solution set on a number line using interval notation. So we know that this number line goes from 2 to 6 based on what's darkened, right? So another way that we can represent this, so you see this pattern here and this here, that's where that falls into play. So we know we can represent this for values from 2 to 6. So the solid dots are going to represent square brackets. Okay. Letter B. So this one, as you can see here, the values go off to negative infinity. Or in other words, the values become more negative, right? So since they become more negative, another way you can represent it is something like this. So if x is less than 3, well, it's going off to negative infinity. If you guys know how to convert here to here, you can go straight to there. But I know some of you, a little bit more visual, it might help to write out that negative infinity. and then convert down. So like I told you earlier, if you don't have an equals underneath, then you put parentheses, or if you're using infinity or negative infinity, that's when you'd also use the parentheses as well. Okay, letter C. This one, so you're gonna have a square bracket because you have a closed dot at 5. So it's going to include everything that's greater than or equal to 5. As you can see, this arrow here, the arrow says it's going off to a positive number. Positive number meaning it goes off to infinity. So just it becomes really large. So that's one way that we can represent that. Okay. Let's look at some examples. And these are the same examples that we went over in class. So let's go ahead and talk about these. So you can see here, we have open circles. We have open circles here. So this is the same thing as -1 is less than x is less than 4. Okay? Or in other words, what we can do is we can write it as, actually, hold on. I'll put it side by side so you can kind of see. So we can convert this to interval notation. So this is -1 to 4. That's another way that we can represent this using interval notation. Okay. This one, letter B. What I see in this case is x is greater than or equal to 4. Okay, so since x is greater than or equal to 4, basically, well, we can actually flip this around, right? This is 4 is less than or equal to x, right? But then we also see the numbers here are going off to a positive number. They're going off to positive infinity, right? So that's another way that we can represent this. And then what we can do is we can convert this into interval notation. So close dot, again, we use square bracket. And since it's going off to positive infinity, we need to put parentheses wherever we use an infinity or negative infinity. Okay, so that's kind of how you would use the interval notation for that. Okay, letter C. This one, what I see here, x has to be less than or equal to -8. So as you can see, the arrow indicates that we're going this way. We're going to, in this case, we're going to go off to negative infinity, right? So it's just going forever that way. So one way we can represent this is we have a parentheses, negative infinity, and we have a square bracket at -8. Okay, so that's generally how that one would work. Okay, let's go ahead and look at letter D. Okay, so letter D here, as you can see, it looks similar. The only difference between C and D this time is the open circle. So if there was an open circle here, you'd have a parentheses here instead. Okay, so the only difference for this is just from negative infinity to 1 with the parentheses. If it helps, write it out. So negative infinity less than x less than 1, and then convert that down here. So that's how you can do that. Letter E. Letter E. Okay, so let's look at this one. Okay, as we can see here, we have an open circle. Okay, so we have an open circle. So one way we can represent this is x is going to be greater than -8. Okay, so in other words, one way we can represent this, we can write it the other way. So we can write it as something like -8 is less than x. And as you can see here, the arrow indicates it's going off to a positive number. So it's going to go off to positive infinity. Okay, so that's another way that we can write this. And in other words, if we were to bring this all together, this is the same thing as the interval notation from -8 to infinity with parentheses. Okay, so it's generally how you would do that. Okay, let's look at letter F. For letter F here, basically what we have here is, as you can see, this interval is restricted. So it doesn't go off to positive infinity, nor does it go off to negative infinity. So it's restricted between what we see here. Okay, so in other words, one way that we can represent this is something like -6 is less than x less than or equal to 1. Okay, so in other words, what we can do is if we want to write it in interval notation, we can just write from -6 to 1. -6 will have the open parentheses, and one will have the square bracket. Okay, and that's generally how you would do letter F. Okay, and that's it. Okay, please let me know if you have any questions on anything. Okay, bless you. Bye.